There are a handful of Nikon APS-C DSLRs that offer exceptional value and are easy to find. They're from right before when cell phones got good enough for most people. I'd say that's around 2012, which was the peak year of DSLR sales. From 1999 to 2018, Nikon released 36 different APS-C cameras. I'm going to skip the original 7 flagships. I think the low megapixels, heavy weight, and large size will result in a bad experience for most people. Due to their age, I also worry about components going bad and transforming them into shelf decorations. With the remaining 29 cameras, I will start with the entry-level models, then the mid-level, prosumer, and end with the flagships. My top choices will be listed in the description. But before that, there are a few specs that are important for new DSLR users to understand. For instance, cameras with CCD sensors are all the rage these days. Keep in mind that CCDs are going to be more difficult to use indoors because of the limited amounts of light. Newer CMOS sensors handle low light situations better and also provide live view and video recording. With any camera, but especially older ones, downloading the manual will help avoid future frustrations. You don't have to read the whole thing, but it will have answers to the most common questions people have. If you want the largest lens selection, get a camera with a built-in focus motor. That means skipping all of the entry-level models. This is because the earliest Nikon F autofocus lenses, the AF and AFD lenses, do not have built-in focus motors. The autofocus in these lenses needs to be driven by a motor in the camera body. As most buyers of entry-level DSLRs were never going to buy another lens other than the one that the camera came with, Nikon didn't bother to put those motors into entry-level bodies to save money. My recommendations for lenses under $100, so this is if you're interested in buying an inexpensive body. The first would be any version of the 18 to 55mm kit lens, preferably with VR, that is vibration reduction, which is Nikon's name for optical image stabilization. That will help you get sharp pictures. Or the 35mm f1.8G if you want a prime, which will be better for low light, such as indoors. For sports action and wildlife, the AFS 70-300 f4.5-5.6G IF ED VR can be found used for around $200. Pay attention to the maximum capacity and type of memory cards a camera uses. Compact flash and XQD cards are discontinued and expensive. While some models can record video, a Nikon DSLR would never be my first choice for that. If you're looking to do video regularly, my advice would be to get a Canon DSLR that is compatible with Magic Lantern. Entry-level cameras aren't perfect, but looking for the perfect camera is a fool's errand. These cameras are ideal if you want to learn and see if you enjoy photography. They'll be more comfortable to use than a phone and are good for casual photography, kids' daytime sports, and events like family gatherings, holidays, or birthdays. They were almost exclusively sold as kits with a 18 to 55 and possibly a second lens, a 55 to 200. Prices for the D40 are all over the place. The main downside to this camera is the 6.1 megapixel sensor. That's not going to give you much room to crop to improve a composition, rotate to level the horizon, or correct perspective on buildings. And that's actually a departure from 35mm film. Keep in mind that this camera was released in 2006 for $600 with a 18 to 55mm kit lens. Another drawback is that it is only compatible with SDHC memory cards. That means you're limited to a maximum capacity of 32 gigabytes. I guess the one thing that people do actually like about it is that it does have a CCD sensor, but so does the D80, which is a higher end camera, has a better build quality, and a built-in focus motor for around the same price. I've used newer and older, so there's no novelty for me. I would only be interested if I could get a complete kit for $50 or less. The D3000 was released in 2009. I'm assuming that's when Nikon ran out of model numbers to use. It's notable for being the last Nikon DSLR to have a CCD sensor. I'm going to assume that's what makes it attractive because other than auctions, the prices seem high to me. My problem is that the specs aren't better than the D80 or D200. They're in the same price range, so go for the professional goodies like a larger viewfinder. The tiny pen-up mirrors in the 3000 series just aren't as nice. The D3100 is the first in the series to have a CMOS sensor. That means you get live view and 1080p 24 with a 10-minute record limit. The actual quality of life improvement is that it uses SDXC cards, which means you can use a maximum capacity up to 2 terabytes. So all that was keeping you from being a YouTube star in 2010 was $700 for the camera and a kit 18 to 55 millimeter lens. To put that into perspective, that's the same year the iPad was released for $500 with 16 gigabytes of storage. I know which one I would currently pick. With how close prices are between models, I think I would pass on this one and look for a deal on the next. The D3200 is when Nikon delivered on everything a person could reasonably expect and want from an entry-level DSLR. A 10 megapixel bump to 24.2 makes cropping and editing easier. It's a nice sweet spot in terms of resolution and storage requirements. Video is now 1080p 30, which I think is much more useful than 24 frames per second. When ISO performance stops being good enough, you do have a built-in flash. You should be able to very easily find this with an 18 to 55 millimeter lens. I think that everything will feel pretty modern by DSLR standards. It has the best price to performance of any of the cameras in the 3000 series. Compared to the D40, I do think the experience would feel $100 better. This would be my camera of choice up until the D5200 or D300. The D3300 sees an upgrade to the X-Speed 4 image processor, which is used in the rest of the cameras in this series. That means it can record 1080p 60 video, but I don't think that is very compelling, because if I was going to want to do video, I would want a flippy screen, and the screen on this camera is fixed. There is going to be a slight improvement in high ISO performance, and it can shoot 5 frames per second, which is great. But it might feel limiting because it only has 11 autofocus points. I'd rather have a D5200 or D7000 because they have 39 autofocus points, more features, and better build qualities. The D3400 was my first DSLR, though I kind of regret it because I should have bought a used D3300. The specs are almost identical, but the D3400 lacks a 3.5 millimeter mic jack, an ultrasonic cleaner to shake off the dust on the sensor, and the flash is weaker. That did save 14 grams in weight. I suppose that makes it better for travel. And ISO performance is going to be marginally improved, though denoising software can take care of that. I wouldn't pay more for it than a D3300. However, if you're looking for a cheap way to get into sports or wildlife, bundles with a 70-300 with VR can be found for pretty attractive prices, and you can have a great time with that setup. The D3500 is the final model in that series. It's also the last APS-C DSLR Nikon released. It was announced a week after Nikon introduced their first mirrorless full-frame camera, the Z7. The specs are almost the same as the D3400, but it has fewer buttons. That would have reduced manufacturing costs, but I don't want to have to menu dive for a setting that previously had a button. I'm convinced this model had lots of cost cutting so that Nikon could continue to sell it for as long as possible. At this price point, I think there are too many other options. Mid-range cameras have slightly better specs and build qualities. The main selling point is that some of the later models have flippy screens and more autofocus points. The D50 is the only mid-range camera with a built-in autofocus motor. It was Nikon's first consumer DSLR released in 2005, making it compatible with only the first SD memory card specification. That means you're limited to cards with a maximum capacity of 2 gigabytes. The sensor is the same that's used on the D40, D70, D70S, and D100. I think I probably prefer the D40 as it can use larger SD cards. If you're willing to put up with compact flash, I'd say go with the D100. If I was learning photography, I would probably want a newer camera. Make sure you're going into this camera with the attitude that you're looking to have fun and get a good price on it. I don't get the D40X naming scheme. It gets an upgrade to the 10.2 megapixel CCD sensor. Shouldn't that be a new model? I guess it's because they are physically identical other than the model name. There are no other notable feature differences. I would only be interested if I could get a complete kit at auction. The D60 is a D40X with the first X-Speed processor. They're going to feel very similar, so my views are the same. I only think it would be worth it if you're able to get a good deal. If it was side by side with a D80, I think you would immediately notice the difference upon picking them up. And if you don't care about a camera having a CCD sensor, I think you would be better with any model that has a CMOS sensor. It's not a bad camera, but I would want to get a deal on it. The D5000 brings a change to the naming scheme along with a CMOS sensor. That opens up the world of glorious 720p 24 video. It has a flappy screen that flaps down, which makes it unusable to record yourself. Decisions like this are why Nikon DSLRs have a bad reputation for video. I would pass because it is too close in price to its replacement. The D5100 has a proper flippy screen and can record 1080p 30 video. It's also compatible with SD-XC cards, so you're good up to 2 terabytes. That's great for recording video, but that shouldn't be a selling point. If you want to shoot video, get a Canon T3i or T4i and put Magic Lantern on them. Where this camera and earlier models disappoint is in their 11-point autofocus systems. I think that all the upgrades in this model check the wrong boxes. I wouldn't pay more for it than a D3200. Released in 2012, the D5200 gets an upgraded 39-point autofocus system that is used in the rest of the cameras in this series. There are no major jumps in resolution, and they all stay at the 5 frames per second continuous shooting. From here on out, all the upgrades are very minor. That shouldn't be too much of a surprise, as right about when this camera was released, sales started falling off a cliff. That's why it's my pick for the best price to performance from the mid-range lineup. The D5300 gets an upgrade to the X-Speed 4 image processor, which is also used on the last 2 models. If you can find a deal on one, go for it. I wouldn't want to pay more for one than a D5200, D7100, or D300. I think any additional money would be better put towards a lens. Though overall I find it hilarious how picky I can be at this price point There's lots of good options from all manufacturers. I'm confused as to why Nikon skipped the D5400 model number, but here we are. The D5500 is a minor improvement. It has a touchscreen and built-in Wi-Fi, but instead of having those features, I would prefer to have a D5200 and another lens. It's a nice model to keep in mind, but I wouldn't want to pounce on one unless it was a great deal. The D5600 ends the series by getting Bluetooth, which I'm not sure how well is supported by Nikon's current phone app, and I really don't have that much interest in checking. It was released in 2016, and by that point, everyone was waiting around to see when Nikon was going to release a full-frame mirrorless camera. Yes, it has a flippy screen, but I would rather have a D7200 for photography or a different system for video. Prosumer or enthusiast models are my favorite cameras because they tend to have excellent ergonomics and specs. You don't know what you're missing out on if you haven't used one. All of these have built-in focus motors, so you can use AF and AFD lenses on them with autofocus. I prefer the gigantic optical viewfinders on these cameras over early electronic viewfinders. Additionally, the autofocus systems on these cameras are more advanced with more focus points, and they can shoot at higher frame rates, making them better for sports, action, and wildlife. The problem with the D70 is all the exterior rubber turns to goo. I believe that the rubber devulcanizes, but it doesn't matter if I'm incorrect because you're still left with a sticky mess. It's comparable in price to the D100 and they have the same sensor. What's interesting is that the specs have it having a 1/5000th of a second flash sync speed, but that can be pushed up to 1/8000th of a second. That's great if you're into flash photography, but if you're not, we all know what's coming up next, the D70S. Probably not what you were expecting, but it does get a larger LCD screen and battery with improved capacity. Due to age, you're really not going to have any idea of how well the batteries, if you get them with the camera, will hold a charge, and you will still need to be concerned about the gooey rubber. I wouldn't pay more for one than a D70, but if you wanted that flash sync speed, I would consider this. Otherwise, I would go with the next camera because the Nikon D80 is the best value APS-C DSLR with a CCD sensor. Yes, the D200 can flappy mirror faster, but the D80 is smaller and lighter, and they both have the same 10.2 megapixel sensor. It's also compatible with SDHC cards, so it's a 32 gigabyte max, where the D200 uses the more expensive and discontinued compact flash. And that's why I think the D80 is the best value. I'm surprised the D90 didn't switch naming schemes because it has a CMOS sensor. That means video, and in this case, it can record cinematic 720p 24. It also gets a big jump up to 4.5 frames per second from the D80's 3. Keep in mind that a D3200 can do 4 and a D3300 can do 5 frames per second. They also all have the same 11-point autofocus system. Overall, I'm just a little underwhelmed with the camera. What makes the D7000 special is that it is the first camera in the series to get the 39-point autofocus system. It's also going to be better than the D80 or D90 in low light, and it sees a switch to having dual memory card slots, in this case SDXC, as well as being able to record 1080p 24 video. If you were to slap a $250 70 to 300 millimeter lens on this camera, you would have a great setup for daytime sports, action, wildlife for under $500. The D7100 has the 24 megapixel sensor everyone loves. Autofocus has been upgraded to a 51-point system that's used for the rest of the series. It also gets 1080p 30 video. At this point, I think Nikon nailed all of the features that everyone wanted out of a DSLR. Though keep in mind, prices are similar to the full-frame D610. They're from the same generation and both use the X-Speed 3 image processor. Full frame will open up more and cheaper wide-angle lens options. However, the DX lenses are currently incredible values. I don't think you can go wrong with a D7100. The D7200 gets an upgrade to the X-Speed 4 image processor, but all the other specs remain the same. It's a nice upgrade, but the increase in price opens the door to a lot of other possibilities. For instance, D800s are in the same price range. And if you're willing to look at other systems, they also have very compelling offerings in this price range. I'd rather have the D7100 and put any savings towards a better lens. Nikon is still selling the D7500. It was released in 2017 and is the final camera in the 7000 series. It's the only camera to share the X-Speed 5 processor and 20.9 megapixel sensor that's in the D500. The flappy mirror is capable of 8 frames per second and it has very good high ISO performance. More importantly, and why I would choose it over the D500, is that it uses SD cards. I still think it's a competitive camera in today's market. I'm interested to see what you think. Would you rather have a Z50 or a Z7500? Professional APS-C bodies have gone away with the switch to mirrorless. I think part of it is that cameras have continued to slowly improve while getting cheaper. Obviously, they've gotten much better at video, but the other part of the situation is that the current market is smaller. That gives these 5 models a unique shooting experience. The D100 is the oldest camera that made it into the video. It's very close to using a film camera because the controls are the same as you would find on a N80, aka F80. I'm sure that sounds like fun to a camera enthusiast, but also keep in mind that electronics can fail at any time, and the older they are, the more likely it's going to happen. If you pull something out, might initially work, but after some heavier use, might end up dead. That's why I would rather have something newer. The D200 is going to be the best camera with a CCD sensor. It has the 10.2 megapixel sensor, can shoot 5 frames per second, but like all the other cameras, only has 11 autofocus points. If you can get one with the original neck strap, you'll have a real head turner. Though where it falls short to me is that it is heavier than the D80 and uses compact flash. That makes it more expensive and less practical than it looks. I feel like anyone interested in this camera probably already owns one or is going to come up with some sort of excuse so they can hoard one. The D300 was released in 2007 along with the very well regarded full frame D700 and D3. It's a proper $1,800 flagship equivalent to 3 D40 kits. $2,700 today is enough to buy a Z52 with 2 lenses and a ZFC with the kit lens. This is when digital photography matured at a consumer level. Obviously, video gets better because the D300 can't record it, but it does have the 51-point autofocus system. The system wasn't used in another camera until 6 years later with the D7100. Using compact flash is a bummer, but I am surprised at how inexpensive these have gotten at auctions. For photography, it or the D300S are the best value. The D300S is basically the same as a D300 with only a couple minor changes. Some buttons were added. It can record 720p 24 video, and there are 2 card slots, 1 compact flash, and 1 SDHC. There isn't much of a difference in price, so obviously I would go for one of these over a D300. We'll end with the best, the D500. It has 153 autofocus points, giving you incredible frame coverage. You can blast away at 10 frames per second. I'm not crazy about XQD cards and compatibility, but with the final firmware, you can use compact express Type B cards in the camera. The SD slot is UHS 2, so spend the extra money on the faster cards. There should be no surprise that prices remain the highest among any of the DX cameras. It's still a competitive choice today for sports, action, or wildlife, especially if you want an optical viewfinder. If you're interested in full-frame Nikons or F-mount lenses, I have videos on those, so go watch them. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.